Well, Martin, thank you very much
again,
indeed for
David.
joining us.
Gosh, grief. Time flies.
And time does fly, because this time last year, David Cameron was the Prime Minister of the UK.
Yeah.
The smart money was on Britain remaining in the EU, and that Hillary Clinton would be the
smart
Prime
money
Minister.
Or dumb money?
Well, clearly it turned out to be dumb money.
It was dumb money,
so
dumb judgments.
What happened?
Well, the judgments were wrong, weren't they? We were sort of sitting in a bubble talking to one another, David, instead of probably doing our proper research. Maybe the samples were wrong. You know, the East Coast Liberals were talking to the East Coast Liberals, and the West Coast Liberals were talking to West Coast Liberals. And London was, well, it wasn't the South East, because the South East by and large voted for Brexit. But the intelligentsia, so-called, in the UK were talking to one another, and they clearly misread the mood, misread the sort of anti-globalization, if that's the right way of putting it, populist feeling that still exists. And it'd be interesting to see what happens in the UK election. Here we are on the cusp of the polls are tightening as we speak. I think somebody said to me it was down to six percentage points between Conservative and Labour. So Jeremy Corbyn might be Prime Minister.
Well, in the context of that then, how do you see the world's economic tectonic plates and the impact for business decision making? Because clearly things are changing.
World economic growth is slow. Inflation is low, although there's clearly inflation growing in the UK because of the weakness of the pound post-Brexit. When we might get more inflation if President Trump implements his tax plans in America. But by and large, there's very little inflation, very little pricing power as a result, and therefore clients are very focused on costs. So for the advertising and marketing services industry, I think it's totally wrong. The investment in branding is not as strong as it should be. And I should add investment in innovation and branding, because I think the key to long-term growth and successful long-term strategies is innovation and brand. And we know from the data that you do at BrandZ or BrandZ, that we do at BAV and elsewhere, that investing in innovation and investing in branding, it accelerates total shareholder return and share prices, and that the strongest brands are the ones that do best against an S&P 500 or an MSCI.
Given the context of that, one of the things clearly we do when we value brands is have a good look at the balance sheet. There's an inordinate amount of cash on most
relatively
companies'
unleveraged
balance sheet.
Yeah.
Given that, why is there such shareholder activization at the moment?
Cheap money.
And what implications does that have to us?
No, cheap money. It's as simple as that, I think. Warren Buffett, I remember at the Microsoft conference, said he never thought in his life he would see in his lifetime ability to borrow 30-year money at such a low rate, and you buy baked beans and tomato ketchup, and that grows or tends to grow year by year. So it's the cost of money is so low, and interest rates have remained lower longer than people projected, and I think a lot of people believe they'll stay lower longer than people think. I mean, they will rise, but they're not going to rise as much as people thought, and it's going to take a longer time for them to rise. I mean, we've seen with the Fed at the moment, there's some suggestion that some of the data they're seeing is not quite as enthusiasm-making for raising rates as before, and that people would be very worried about choking off continued growth. So I think the cheap money is driving. So there are three forces: technological disruption, activist investors, and zero-based budgeting, which is very focused on costs. Those are the three forces. The last two, activist and zero-based budgeting, I think are driven to a large extent by cheap money. And as long as that persists, you're going to continue to see the pressure. We've had a long cycle since 2009. We're seeing a lot of M&A activity, probably because people have run out of opportunities. They're seeing slow growth, and they run out of opportunities to cut costs, so they need another beast to get their teeth into.
Tomorrow is the WPP annual general shareholder meeting.
Yes.
Here in London.
Right.
When you address the meeting, what direction will you be saying WPP is going in, and also the direction of the marketing industry worldwide?
Well, four strategic objectives for us: horizontality, to get just as we brought BrandZ or BrandZ and BAV together, horizontality, working together, not against one another, but working together for the benefit of clients. That what clients want is the best integrated response to their needs, or their opportunities and their challenges. Secondly, the growing importance of digital, which is already 40% of our business, and we want it to be even more, and you won't be able to distinguish it in short order between analog and digital. Fast growth markets, 30% of our business. We want it to be about the same as digital.
And
40,
you're still
45.
bullish about fast growth markets?
Absolutely, because the next billion, it's very simple. The next billion consumers are not going to come from the US and Western Europe. And whatever is happening to multinational companies, and some interesting articles recently about whether multinational companies are as profitable as they used to be, whether they're growing as fast as they used to be. I mean, a lot of that's to do with currency, the strength of the dollar, but it's also to do with the fact that the BRICS and Next 11 slowed. Although they, when we look at the Next 11 in our case, we'd still see a significant growth and in fact a pickup. But of the BRICS, India is the only one which is continuing to rev along, and even that demonetization has checked a little bit of it. But the BRICS and Next 11 are going to supply that next billion consumers. So my view, you need increased focus on that. And then the final point is data, which is 25% of our business, or quantitative disciplines, about half of our business, and that's right. So more from WPP on that, and we'll be featuring particularly the horizontality part of that at the AGM. But generally, to stress this message that investment, what people call capex rather than opex. I mean, there's tremendous pressure on operating expenditure and operating costs, and that has resulted in very little investment capex. In fact, if you plot investment as a portion of GDP, pretty much, whichever of the mature countries you look at, whether you look at the US or the UK or France, Germany, Italy, Spain, it's been on a downward track since the 80s. I mean, it's recovered since the recession of a deep recession of 2009. But essentially, the animal spirits are dull. The S&P 500 is effectively shrinking because they're paying back more than 100% of their earnings to investors in the forms of dividends and buybacks. That's effectively saying we are abrogating responsibility for reinvestment of the profits we make into the business and giving it to the shareholders to decide what they do with it. I think that's wrong. And the irony of all that is that the companies that take the long-term view are the control companies, the ones that tend to offend the corporate governance wonks who, one man, one vote, one woman, one vote, which we could all agree with, that's democracy. But on the other hand, if you're worried about being turfed out for having taken too much risk or make a mistake, I mean, for every 2 successes, you would hope you'd only have 1 failure, and you've got to take some risks.
If you look at the BrandZ Top 100 Most Valuable Global Brands 12 years ago, when you were responsible for starting the notion of doing this, compared to today, what are your biggest
frustrated that one of our competitors seemed to have a monopoly on brand. Now we have the superior technique by far. They just do some sort of panel of experts, maybe modified with a little bit of data. We have this very sophisticated measurement of not just brand metrics but financial metrics. And now I think we've established, well, you've and your crew have established, Doreen and everybody else have established BrandZ or BrandZ as the market leader, but we have to make it even more famous.
We're putting together BrandZ and BAV together. You might say, about time to taken longer than you wanted it to happen.
It is about time. It's taken a long time, like pulling teeth.
What advantage do you think that's going to give both the group and, I suppose, more importantly, our clients?
Well, I mean, if we look at the branding survey this year, which is our 12th, right?
12th year,
yeah. The fearsome 5, as we call them, top it. So we have Google and Apple and Microsoft and Amazon and Facebook are all topping the list.
Of course, most of those 12 years ago
didn't exist.
And
the 5 that were at the top 12 years ago employed a lot more people, which raises all sorts of social issues going back to where we started. But putting BAV together with BrandZ or BrandZ, I think gives us even more clout in the brand valuation space, and also deals with what I think is the fundamental issue, is demonstrating clearly that what we do adds value, and the clients fail to invest in advertising and marketing at their peril. That if you're in the business of building, so going back to John Brown's definition of what, he was talking about CSR, and he said, if you're in the business of building long-term brands, you won't ignore all the stakeholders and communities you operate in. Well, I would say if you're in the business of building long-term brands, you won't reduce, diminish, cut to oblivion your investment in advertising and marketing, because that's the lifeblood. And once you see volume growth start to tail off, and there are many examples of where some clients are maybe getting a little bit of revenue growth because of pricing, a little bit, particularly in Latin America, for example. But when you see those volumes tail off, that's the danger signal. And that's when you have to reinvest. And maybe getting the balance between advertising and promotion is important. Instead of paying large amounts of money for slotting allowances and the like, what you should be doing is investing in the brand, not just in what we do, but adjunct or the origins of what we do in innovation. I mean, in FMCG, for example, which is under significant pressure for all sorts of reasons, the technological disruption, activist investors and ZBB, what you have to do is to innovate. Or you innovate or you die, and I think you innovate and you advertise or you die.
Innovate, advertise, or die.
Yes.
That's a great way to leave it. Martin Sorrell, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.